Hey everyone, it's Jean Chatsky. Thanks so much for joining me today on Her Money, where we talk about personal finance and how money touches everything in our lives. Here's something I know, as Oprah likes to say, for sure. America runs on women. It runs on our paid work, our caregiving, our invisible work. All of that put together keeps the country going, and it's taking its toll. According to the American Psychological Association's 2023 Stress in America survey, women say we are feeling stressed, misunderstood, and alone. The survey also found we were more likely to say we strongly agree that no one understands how stressed we are, and less likely to report that we can get over our stressors quickly. But we also know that in other countries, women are not expected to shoulder as much of the burden of all of these things. Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden. These are the top countries for women, according to the 2023 study by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. That piece of research also found, unsurprisingly, that women's well-being is directly linked with the well-being of their country, and the U.S. ranked 37th on the list. My guest today is going to help us dig into all of these things. She is a sociologist who has dedicated her life's work to understanding how America got this way, despite being consistently ranked as one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Jessica Calarco is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers. She is an expert on families, schools, and inequalities. She's the author of multiple award-winning books, including her latest, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. That's what I feel like I'm doing many days these days. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I gotta say, I love that title. I mean, it just describes so much of life and how it feels to be a woman of, I would imagine, many ages in America. How did you come to it?
Sure. I mean, this was a title that, it took a while to figure out what the right title for this book would be. But once we settled on it as a team that I was working with, it fit both because it describes, as you were saying, this feeling of having to be the one who manages all of the things and is the backstop for families and communities and society. And then it also points to what I think the potential solution is here, in the sense that we don't have to hold it together individually. We can actually do this better collectively, that we can imagine a society where we actually hold risk together in a way that would better serve all of us. And so I like it both for the way that it describes what we're all feeling right now, but also a potential path forward as well.
Let's take those things one by one, because I want to talk about the problem and how we got here. But I definitely want to get to the solutions, because I know my audience, and this is a crowd that really likes the tactical, practical solutions that can get us from one place to the next. In the book, you call the U.S. a DIY society, where people are expected to solve their own problems rather than count on the government or even their employer to support them, and one where people who fail to do this are in fact shamed and denied support. Where did this come from? I mean, as I sort of read that sentence, I can point to things that changed in our working world and social safety net, but how do we get here?
Sure. I think I talk in the book about how we can trace the origins of this DIY society model in part back to the wake of the New Deal programs that were put in place in the 1930s. These policy programs that were put into place cost a decent amount of money. They cost employers, they cost large corporations and wealthy people in terms of higher taxes. This was a moment where we were shifting the way that we think about our social safety net and the way that we fund our social safety net. And many wealthy people and corporations were not particularly happy with those developments. And essentially what happened is that a group of kind of wealthy business owners and their kind of folks that support them in those efforts were looking for ways to persuade Americans that we could get by without this new and stronger social safety net. And what they found was a group of Austrian economists who were developing neoliberal theory at the time in the 1930s. And essentially the idea was that societies don't need a social safety net and that people will actually be better off without one because they will make choices that will keep themselves safe if they don't have a net to rely on. And that this is sort of the core of neoliberal theory. And so these big business owners imported these Austrian economists to the US and installed them in high profile positions in elite academies in the US. And they went on to train folks like Milton Friedman, who then went on to be sort of the architects of our modern social system in terms of the policies that they're lowering tax rates and deregulating corporations and dismantling key parts of the social safety net that we've moved through in almost the last 100 years now. And certainly have also been responsible, those same kinds of elite folks behind the scenes were responsible for massive propaganda campaigns. Things like General Electric Theater, which was a massively popular television program that ran for a large chunk of the 20th century that was hosted by Ronald Reagan and sort of helped to promote this idea that people could pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and that if people just make these right choices, that they'll be able to be successful no matter what kind of hardship that they face. And so really that kind of laid the groundwork for people believing that we could get by without a social safety net in ways that other countries have seen that it's necessary to use large-scale government programs to help people manage risk, that without that kind of support, communities and families are stressed and crumbling in ways that is incredibly difficult to overcome, at least without women oftentimes being the ones to hold it together in the background to keep us from falling apart.
How are women specifically the ones holding this all together?
Sure. I mean, I think the key here is that women are kind of doing two different types of labor that helps to hold together both our economy and our social safety net. On the one hand, they are the default caregivers. When things break down, they are the ones who care for the children, for the elderly, for the sick, for people who are in need in their communities. At the same time, women are also the ones who disproportionately fill the lowest paid jobs in our economy. 70% of the lowest wage jobs in the US are held by women. And essentially, those are often jobs that are too labor intensive and too difficult to outsource to be highly profitable. Jobs in childcare, jobs in home health care, jobs in customer service. Many of these jobs in particular industries are it's very difficult to make a profit off of those jobs in our sort of market-driven, profit-focused economy. And so we have an interest in pushing those jobs onto people who can be easily exploited or forced to take whatever job is available to them. And that's how we've structured parts of our social safety net. Welfare, for example, requires people to work for pay in order to qualify for that kind of government support. You can't be going to college. You can't be doing other kinds of things. Caring for children is not enough to be able to qualify for welfare. You also have to work for pay. And so many of those women, and it's overwhelmingly low-income single moms who are relying on welfare, are often the ones who are filling these lowest paid jobs. And so it's both, on the one hand, the unpaid labor that women are doing for their families and communities, and also the underpaid labor that women are doing, filling in the gaps in our economy as well.
We've also, in the last, not 100 years, but maybe 3 decades, undergone this big shift in employer benefits since the invention of the 401k, since pensions, which not everybody had to begin with, but about half of workers had. Since pensions started disappearing, 401ks took their place. The responsibility for funding our retirements and to a large extent our health care fell off the shoulders of America's corporations and onto the shoulders of individuals who had absolutely no training or knowledge in how to make this work. What difference did that make in the equation?
And I think that puts tremendous pressure on families to focus as much of their energies on paid work as possible. It kind of amplifies the kinds of overwork norms that we see in society that push us to focus on getting the best job possible, making sure that we have access to those kinds of employer benefits to the extent that they do exist, to have the possibility of having a retirement fund even. And so that forces people to work as many hours as possible for as long as they can, oftentimes in jobs that don't offer many opportunities for upward mobility or that don't offer possibilities for pay raises over time. And so thinking about how this system pushes people to often work beyond what is reasonable for their daily lives. And I think this also exacerbates things like the childcare crisis or the elder care crisis, in the sense that people often end up working. Many of the families that I talk to, generations ago might have been able to rely on grandma to watch their children. But now she's still working into her 70s because she can't afford to retire, given the kind of system that we're in. And so this certainly exacerbates challenges on many fronts as well.
I've thought forever that childcare is really the key here, right? I mean, you look at a place like Canada, and the childcare system in Canada works to such an extent that both parents can actually be in the workforce without having to worry about who is going to take care of their kids in a way that isn't stressing the parents out every single minute of every day. I was interested to read some of the history in the book and to realize that Congress, and you write this at the beginning of the book, once voted to fund an affordable national childcare system, a system that turned out to be highly effective, but was dismantled almost as soon as it began. I never knew about this, but what happened?
Yeah, I mean, essentially during World War II, the War Manpower Commission figured out that they needed as many women in the workforce as possible, with many men off fighting in battle. And they were fairly successful in getting kind of unmarried women and women without children into the workforce fairly quickly, just through sort of campaigns to encourage them to take jobs. But that wasn't enough. And really what they needed was married women and women with young children to join the workforce as well. At the time, only about 1 in 30 of them were employed. And what they figured out in the process was that childcare was one of the key missing links in terms of getting women, especially those with young children, to be able to join the workforce. And so they used funds from the Lanham Act, which was designed to provide things like housing or other types of infrastructure in support of defense production centers. It took a while. Congress was not super on board with this idea of using defense funds to fund childcare. But in 1943, they started allocating funds to set up childcare centers across the U.S. in communities that were playing a big part in war production efforts. And these increased the employment rate among women with young children from 1 in 30 to 1 in 6. And so this was a tremendously successful program. And it wasn't even fully universal. It didn't hit every community across the U.S. But even still, it had this massive positive impact on women's employment and on their independence, on their financial independence. And almost all of the women who took jobs as part of this effort wanted to stay in the workforce, wanted to be able to continue those jobs and keep their kids in childcare once the war ended, in part because these were well-funded, high-quality childcare centers that often offered care for 10 or 12 hours a day, kind of for less than $10 per day in today's dollars in terms of what they cost families, with highly trained staff and with kind of high-quality facilities. So this was a great solution for many families, and yet we kind of instead opted, when men returned from war, to focus on the short-term productivity of the economy and to prioritize men's jobs, and instead tell women not only that we were going to shutter these childcare centers, but that if they wanted to stay in the workforce, they had to figure it out themselves. And at the time, many communities and corporations even brought back things like marriage bans that had been in place before World War II to kind of further push women back home. So we not only cut off their childcare access, but also allowed employers to simply discriminate against women and mothers and say that they couldn't have jobs or were forced to take the most menial jobs in our economy instead.
And so where we are today is in this unmanageable position. You tell a story in the book of a couple, Holly and Kathleen. Holly was working part-time. Kathleen was working full-time. When they got pregnant, they wanted to split childcare duties equally, which, by the way, is more popular among same-sex couples. But since Holly was working part-time, she was forced to cut her hours, which eventually dwindled to fewer than 15 a week. This happens over and over again. We saw it in the pandemic. As this continues, if you look out in your crystal ball, if you're looking 10, 20, 30 years from now, what sort of additional changes has this system caused in society? What do we look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly created this missing middle when it comes to childcare. It's created bigger economic divisions between the financial haves and have-nots in our society, and even between those in the middle and those at the top or the bottom, in the sense that the way things like childcare work, you can get access to government subsidies for childcare if you have a very low income. And so that's oftentimes less than 127% of the federal poverty line, which is, usually less than $30,000 a year for a family of three. Or, you have to be able to afford $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month to pay for childcare. And most of the families, the vast majority of families in the US, live in this middle where they can't, they would actually be cash negative if they were to pay for full-time childcare, given what even two partners together are able to earn. And so many of those families, in part because of gender pay gaps, it's usually women who end up sacrificing their careers or shifting to part-time because we devalue women's labor in ways that makes it seem logical for families to sacrifice women's paid work when someone has to stay home. And this is part of why I talk in the book how we have this sort of stereotypical notion of stay-at-home motherhood. But in reality, almost 75% of stay-at-home moms in the US have household incomes of less than $50,000 a year. And so this is not the group that we picture it to be. Instead, most of these women are pushed into this circumstance by virtue of our lack of investment in childcare. And I think what that's unfortunately doing is creating a captive audience for messages that promote that valorize stay-at-home motherhood and that give women an alternate path and give men a sort of way to think of themselves as good guys if they have wives who stay home. This sort of, we've seen a sort of resurgence of sexist messaging around this idea that women are just happier at home, that men should focus on paid work. And I think this missing middle of childcare is playing a big role in promoting that kind of resurgence of sexist ideologies, because it's a way for men to feel like, they're not hurting women by taking jobs and by being the ones who focus on paid work. And it's a way for women to feel valuable in the work that they're doing, even if they're not able to work for pay. If they focus on the benefits of raising a child and feeling like the best thing for their children, it can be a sort of consolation from the fact that they're not able to work for pay, given the kinds of challenges that they're up against. So I'm concerned about how this moment that we're in, this childcare crisis that we're seeing, may help to fuel a sort of resurgence of deep sexist attitudes as we move forward into the future.
We're seeing it. I mean, we did a whole show on trad wives and with Anne Helen Peterson, by the way. If you haven't listened to it, it was phenomenal. But just sort of unpacking Ballerina Farm and all the other examples that are out there without even pointing to the fact that so many of them have grown up with incredible wealth and are putting examples out into the world that look amazing, but in reality are unsustainable unless your father started an airline, which happens to be the case with Ballerina Farm. You write about women who have flipped the gender script, and we know that there are women out there who are making more than our partners. How do we lean into that, into these educational advances, and use this ability to not just close the gender wage gap a little bit, but to actually maybe level the playing fields for our families?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be a little bit careful on that front, in the sense that the research shows that there's actually a sweet spot for women, which is right when they and their partners, if they have men partners, are earning almost exactly the same amount of money. That's when men are the most likely to participate actively and equally when it comes to things like housework and childcare. And that actually, once women start out earning their husbands, it goes the other way, where we start to see a resurgence of women doing more of the household labor, even when they're the primary breadwinners, and men doing less, because it gets at men's egos. And there's sort of there's these lingering sort of sexist attitudes around men who kind of do too much at home. And that's, I think is something we have to be mindful of, that we can't solve this with promoting women's success alone, that we have to get men to rethink what masculinity means to be able to buy into that. But yeah.
Tell me more about that research. Tell me more about those numbers. I mean, where does the salary have to end up, and how much does it have to move in the other direction in order for your male spouse to stop vacuuming?
It doesn't have to move very far at all, unfortunately. That pretty much if you get past 50% of the income coming from women, it's very quickly turns over into kind of women starting to do more and more of the labor. And then there are men who are stay-at-home partners, and we talked to a couple of those for the book. And that's a situation where, if it goes maybe to the furthest extreme, but even in those couples, the moms who had stay-at-home partners that we talked to, they often felt like they still had to do a lot at home, certainly far more than the men that we talked to who had stay-at-home wives, in part because they talked about how they felt guilty that their partners had sacrificed for their careers, and because they recognized in ways that men often didn't that their partners were struggling with the responsibilities of being a full-time parent or a full-time caregiver. And so I think just kind of pushing men into to be the stay-at-home partners doesn't necessarily solve the problem, that instead we have to think about, regardless of who's in those kinds of caregiver roles, what would it take to promote better support for all of us to participate more equitably and more equally in caregiving, and kind of sharing this as a shared project of care, and also making it possible to outsource some of that labor for families through things like universal childcare, while also putting in place things like universal paid family leave, universal paid vacation time, potentially limits on paid work hours, the way that places like France have done, in a way to make it more possible for all of us, regardless of what our income differences happen to be, to participate in this care and to feel like we have the time and the energy, and that we don't just have to focus all of our energies on paid work, regardless of who happens to be the breadwinner in a given family.
There have been a number of stories recently about the plummeting birth rate in this country and in others. How much of that do you think is an offshoot of this conversation that we're having? How much of the fact that people are deciding to have fewer kids or not to have children at all has to do with them seeing this situation and thinking, I just can't?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we talked to some families where that was the thinking that they had, sometimes before they had kids, or they knew people who were in this kind of a boat. And yes, definitely, this is a factor in the sense that it has become increasingly expensive and increasingly difficult to raise young children in American society and in many other countries as well. The amount of social safety net support that countries have is linked to the kind of birth rate and what we see. It's not the only factor that matters. I mean, I think we have to think about other potential contributing factors here too. And if anything, I would say that we have to question why we actually see a higher birth rate in the US than we do in other countries with even stronger social safety nets. And I think that gets at how we've promoted things like marriage and parenthood as this sort of path to a sense of adulthood or a sense of identity, particularly for women, that we sort of continued to glorify and valorize motherhood as sort of the only path to kind of real womanhood in society, in ways that have kind of kept birth rates high, in ways that maybe other countries haven't. And certainly the religiosity that we see here too. Many of the women that we interviewed talked about kind of feeling pressure from family, from communities, particularly religious communities, to have more children, even when they were maybe comfortable with not having any, or maybe comfortable with just having one. And so I think we have to think about the role of religion in American society, potentially even keeping our birth rate kind of artificially higher than what it would be if we were just relying on our absence of a social safety net as the predictor of people's choices.
The birth rate and also marriage. We recently had Jo Piazza on the show. She said, and I've heard this before, but it was a treat to hear her say, a man is not the plan. You write that many women in particularly low-income rural communities think that marriage is actually the key to financial success. Why is this a myth, and how are we starting to move away from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing here, it's easy for conservative think tanks to sort of hold up this idea that on paper, married couples often look like they're doing better than those who aren't. Women in married couples, they have access to more financial resources, in part because of these gender pay gaps. But what that kind of research tends to ignore is the fact that correlation is not causation, and that the kinds of factors that facilitate marriage, particularly among kind of Americans, where we see, we treat marriage as this sort of outcome of a successful process, as opposed to something that you build, that you really, many low-income families in the US in particular see that they have to be financially successful before they can even think about marriage, not only because of the costs of a wedding, but because of the financial assumptions that come with it and the sort of personal assumptions that come with it, that you're making a commitment to this person, and that those commitments are incredibly difficult to maintain in the context context of financial precarity, that financial precarity is the strongest predictor of divorce and of relationship breakup when it comes to couples in the US. And it's also one of the primary reasons why couples don't get married in the first place, even if they have children together, because they know that this is going to be a source of ongoing stress and tension, and that sometimes it's just easier to not be together in those kinds of contexts, particularly, and it's actually even better for children if there's going to be a high level of conflict in those couples too, that it's much better for kids to have two parents living separately than to have two parents living together if that conflict is going to be frequent or intense, or certainly if it's going to lead to violence. And that's one of the risks that we have with this sort of pro-marriage culture, is kind of keeping women trapped in some cases in very difficult or even dangerous relationships. And yet, in part because of how we structure our society financially, things like access to health insurance. I talked to one mom, for example, who thought about leaving her partner in the wake of some very kind of difficult circumstances that they were up against together, and yet decided to stay, in part because he had access to really good health insurance and she had chronic conditions and she was a stay-at-home mom and knew that her financial prospects for what she'd be able to do on her own were not particularly great. And so that for her was a really hard decision to make.
In the book, you argue for a lot of things that I think would be really amazing, not just affordable childcare, but paid family leave, sick leave. I mean, we've talked about a lot of these free elder care. They're very big asks. So let's talk about what I can do as an individual woman who is just trying to raise my family, maybe make some sort of a contribution to help my children go to college, eventually have a comfortable, if not lavish, retirement. What can I do, and my listeners, to right our own ships?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is recognizing that maybe the first step is what I talk about as sort of ungaslighting, that recognizing that the struggles that you're up against are the product of the society that we live in, and not because you've made some sort of set of poor choices along the way. That really society is designed, that we've designed these structures to push women into being the ones who are these default caregivers, who fill in these gaps in our economy and our social safety net. And so kind of letting go of the guilt that comes with the kinds of burdens that we face is a big piece of this. I think the second part is to recognize that these kinds of big systemic changes are possible. And, we can put in place the kinds of politicians and policymakers who will push for these if enough people do so. But I talk in the book about how there's a lot of mythical thinking that we do as Americans that dissuades us from seeing the value of a social safety net, and also that urges us to focus on divisions between us. Even relatively low-income women often get a sense of superiority, for example, by thinking of themselves as better than women who have to rely on welfare or have to rely on food stamps. And so if we see that for what it is, for the kinds of myths of meritocracy or kind of gendered myths that encourage us to focus on divisions between us, if we catch ourselves thinking in those mythical ways and call it out in others, then we can start to push back against some of those myths that help to dissuade us from fighting for that stronger social safety net. And so I think that's one small thing that we can do is to catch ourselves in that kind of mythical thinking, call it out in other people, and then potentially redirect some of the individual energy that we often spend on judging ourselves and judging each other to finding ways to fight collectively. Facebook moms groups, for example, are a place where lots of mothers of young children spend a lot of time thinking about, am I doing things right? And that's a place where we could be looking toward collective organizing, finding the mom in the group who wants to run for local office and saying, okay, how can we collectively support her in that kind of a campaign? And those are the kinds of things where I think we have the energy. We're just oftentimes using it in ways that are more self-destructive, and we can put it toward more collective ends in the process. I think that's one place where we can focus some of those choices, in addition to letting go of some of the guilt and the self-blame.
Love letting go of the guilt. Absolutely. Jessica Calarco, the book is Holding It Together. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you so much. This was fun and super enjoyable. Thank you.